The Spanish camp has finally reached its breaking point. After weeks of silent desperation and mysterious tournament withdrawals, Juan Carlos Ferrero just exploded against the media regarding the true state of Carlos Alcaraz and his devastated right arm. You must understand the gravity of this specific moment. Ferrero is a man known throughout the ATP Tour for his absolute calm and his extreme discipline. He is a former world number one who survived the most intense pressure imaginable during his own career. He never loses his composure in public. He never lets the cameras see him sweat. Yet the escalating chaos surrounding the physical collapse of his star pupil just forced him to snap completely. Ferrero delivered a brutal and direct attack against the journalists and the constant wave of toxic speculation flooding the internet. He looked directly at the reporters and made it perfectly clear that the relentless pressure from the press is destroying the mental health of a young player who is already fighting a massive career-threatening crisis. The Spanish coach did not hold back a single emotion. He condemned the relentless demand for daily medical updates. He exposed the absolute greed of a tennis ecosystem that demands a new superstar to sacrifice his body just to sell tickets for the upcoming tournaments. The ATP Tour relies entirely on the massive draw of Carlos Alcaraz to drive global viewership. Without him stepping onto the red clay of Paris, the tournament organizers face a massive disaster. This creates a terrifying external pressure to rush his recovery. But we have to ask a terrifying question right now. Did the media simply cross a line of basic respect, or is Ferrero desperately trying to cover up a medical reality so catastrophic that he panicked in front of the entire world? What exactly is happening inside that locker room? How terrifying is the medical reality behind closed doors that forced a veteran champion like Ferrero to completely lose his temper in front of the world? The timeline of destruction leading up to this unprecedented outburst is absolute chaos. It started with a shocking and sudden exit from Monte Carlo. Everyone thought it was just a minor precaution for the heavy clay court season. Then the nightmare spread directly to Barcelona. By the time Carlos vanished from the Madrid Open and finally Rome, the global tennis media descended into a complete frenzy. They started inventing wild conspiracy theories about a hidden surgery or a secret permanent damage to the ligaments in his wrist. The Spanish press demanded clear answers immediately. Every single morning brought a new terrifying headline questioning the bravery, the dedication, and the physical ceiling of Carlos Alcaraz. Some journalists even dared to suggest that Carlos was simply afraid of facing his biggest rivals, while not at 100% capacity. This relentless noise and these insulting accusations are exactly what triggered the massive explosion from Juan Carlos Ferrero. He stood in front of the flashing cameras and furiously condemned the absolute lack of empathy from the sports reporters. He stated that the media is treating a severely injured human being like a broken machine that just needs to be patched up and forced back onto the dirt of Roland Garros for public entertainment. The anger was visceral and incredibly loud. Ferrero knows that this toxic environment is a deadly trap for his player. The extreme psychological burden of reading these brutal articles is crushing Carlos just as his physical body is failing him on the court. Young athletes are constantly scrolling through social media and reading the exact words of their loudest critics. Look closely at the faces of the medical team surrounding the young Spanish star over the last 3 weeks. Their expressions are filled with pure anxiety and absolute dread. The physical therapists are working around the clock in complete silence. The closed practice sessions look like a tense hospital ward, rather than a high-energy training camp for a major event. Every single forehand hit during these secret sessions is followed by a nervous glance toward the coaching staff. They are holding their breath every time Carlos swings the racket. The silence on the practice court is deafening. Ferrero is screaming at the press because he is losing control of the narrative, and he is terrified of permanently losing his player. He is watching the heavy burden of public expectation crush the spirit of his absolute greatest achievement as a coach. The truth about the wrist and the forearm is slipping through their fingers. No matter how aggressively Ferrero tries to block the reporters from discovering the exact medical diagnosis, the anger of Ferrero is not just about bad journalism. It is a desperate shield to hide a much darker reality about the physical breakdown of Carlos Alcaraz. This medical crisis is rapidly mutating into a historic disaster for the current era of tennis. So make sure you stay absolutely locked to our channel as we continue to uncover every single hidden detail behind this devastating injury and the true fate of the Spanish superstar. To understand the sheer panic and absolute fury of Ferrero, You have to look directly at the violent biomechanics of Carlos Alcaraz. The sports media completely misunderstands the actual root cause of this terrifying physical collapse. They think this is just a random muscle strain or a simple case of bad luck on the practice court. They are entirely wrong. The extreme devastation happening inside the right arm of Carlos is a direct result of his own spectacular playing style. Look at the way he generates that terrifying racket head speed on his forehand. He uses an incredibly extreme grip and a violent whip of the wrist to create massive topspin and blinding pace. That specific technique is beautiful to watch, but it is physically destructive. The deceleration phase of his swing puts unimaginable stress on the tendons connecting his forearm to his hand. Traditional players hit through the ball with a flatter trajectory, protecting their joints. Carlos violently brushes up the back of the tennis ball, generating heavy revolutions that defy physics. But human biology has strict limits. The sheer torque placed on the delicate tendons and ligaments of his forearm with every single swing is astronomical. Ferrero understands this anatomical nightmare better than anyone alive. He knows that the human body simply cannot sustain that level of violent rotation week after week on the heavy, grinding red clay of the ATP Tour. The clay courts absorb the pace of the ball, forcing Carlos to swing even harder, completely redlining his physical limits on every single point. Ferrero is screaming at the press because they are aggressively pushing a young man to step onto the court and permanently destroy the structural integrity of his right arm just to appease the public. The media wants a gladiator to bleed for their entertainment. They demand that he plays through the pain to defend his massive ranking points. But Ferrero sees the horrifying long-term reality. If Carlos snaps a major tendon in his wrist right now, the explosive forehand that made him a global phenomenon might be gone forever. The recovery from a severe wrist surgery for a professional tennis player is notoriously brutal and often entirely unsuccessful. Many former prodigies never regain their raw power after going under the surgical knife. Ferrero is fighting a desperate war against the short-sighted demands of the big media because he is trying to save the biological weapon that makes Carlos great. He is acting as a human shield. The reporters want total transparency, but they do not realize the immense danger of exposing the full truth. If the medical reports officially confirm a structural weakness in his wrist, the locker room will weaponize that information instantly. Every opponent will exploit it mercilessly on the court. The media demanded clear answers, but Ferrero knows that revealing the exact medical details would give the rest of the ATP Tour the ultimate blueprint to destroy his player. However, the physical damage to his right arm is just the visible tip of a massive, terrifying iceberg threatening to sink his entire career. The real danger here goes far beyond a single torn muscle or an inflamed wrist joint. The massive twist in this nightmare scenario is that the anger of Ferrero is actually pure panic, covering up a much darker timeline. Ferrero is terrified that Carlos is not just going to miss Roland Garros, but that he might lose this entire season and permanently alter the trajectory of his legacy. The fundamental flaw is the brutal scheduling and the crushing weight of defending massive ranking points at such an incredibly young age. Carlos was pushed too hard, too fast, across too many surfaces. He is trapped in a vicious cycle of winning early, accumulating massive global expectations, and then breaking down physically trying to maintain that impossible standard. We have seen this exact tragedy play out before in the long history of tennis. Are we witnessing the devastating early burnout of a generational genius? Do you think the explosive, violent playing style of Carlos is ultimately going to shorten his career and prevent him from reaching his true potential? Let me know your exact thoughts down in the comments because the American tennis audience is extremely divided on whether Carlos needs to completely rebuild his game to survive the ruthless tour. The mental toll of this crisis is just as dangerous as the physical damage. Carlos is sitting in the dark reading articles that question his courage and his heart. The Spanish media is aggressively comparing him to Rafael Nadal. They expect Carlos to ignore the agony, strap up his wrist, and win Roland Garros on one leg just like his idol did in the past. This toxic comparison is exactly what triggered the absolute rage of Juan Carlos Ferrero. He knows that Carlos is not Nadal. Carlos has a completely different body type and a different biological threshold. Forcing him to chase the impossible ghost of Nadal will only lead to a devastating medical tragedy. He is a fierce competitor who wants to fight, but his body is completely betraying him. The absolute exhaustion of trying to prove his bravery to journalists, while his wrist throbs in pain, is draining his spirit. Ferrero sees the light fading in the eyes of his champion. He sees the heavy burden of being the face of the sport crushing a young man who just wants to play tennis. The anger Ferrero unleashed on the media was a desperate cry for mercy. He wants the world to stop suffocating his player before the damage becomes completely irreversible. The stakes have never been this incredibly high. A single mistake in scheduling right now could trigger a catastrophic injury that ends the magic of Carlos Alcaraz forever. While Ferrero fiercely battles the press to protect his player mentally, the wolves of the ATP Tour are already circling the courts, smelling blood in the water. In the exact moment that Ferrero is screaming at the cameras, Jannik Sinner is quietly tightening his absolute grip on the top of the professional tennis game. The sheer contrast between these two rival camps right now is incredibly cruel and absolutely terrifying. While the locker room of Carlos Alcaraz looks like a chaotic emergency ward filled with angry coaches and panicked doctors, Jannik Sinner is operating with the cold and flawless efficiency of a machine. Sinner is not giving dramatic press conferences to defend his physical condition. Sinner is not dealing with a massive and toxic media circus every single morning. Sinner is simply stepping onto the practice courts across Europe, hitting his flat baseline strokes with zero physical pain, and preparing to dominate the main draw of Roland Garros. The Italian champion is watching this entire Spanish soap opera unfold from a position of supreme safety and absolute power. The physical breakdown of Carlos is the ultimate tactical gift to the career of Jannik Sinner. Carlos is currently trapped in a mental nightmare, where his own body is completely betraying him, and he has to watch his biggest rival pull further and further ahead in the global rankings. Sinner is establishing a terrifying new reality, where he stands completely alone at the summit of the sport without any true equal. The media love to promote the concept of a perfectly balanced rivalry between these two young giants. But that balanced dynamic is rapidly dissolving into a one-sided dictatorship. Carlos feels this massive psychological shift happening in real time from his rehabilitation table. He knows that every single week he spends icing his wrist and doing physical therapy is another week that Sinner spends lifting championship trophies and destroying the rest of the elite tour. The mental damage of watching your ultimate rival succeed flawlessly while you are hopelessly broken is an unimaginable burden for a young athlete. The pressure on Carlos is multiplying exponentially because the entire world is watching Sinner thrive in his absolute absence. Jannik Sinner does not need to engage in the toxic media war currently destroying the Spanish camp. Sinner does not have to say a single word to the media. The sheer chaos surrounding Carlos is doing all the psychological damage for him. We are now standing at the absolute precipice of a career-defining moment for the Spanish phenomenon. The official deadline for the French Open tournament draw is approaching incredibly fast, and the tension is suffocating. The coaching team of Juan Carlos Ferrero has completely run out of time to hide behind vague press releases and angry outbursts. They must make the most ruthless and terrifying decision of their entire lives within the next few days. There are only two possible paths left for the immediate future of Carlos Alcaraz, and both of them involve immense suffering and massive consequences. Path 1 requires Carlos to listen strictly to his medical team, completely ignore the massive outrage from the global media, officially withdraw from Roland Garros, and potentially miss the historic grass courts of Wimbledon just to let his wrist heal properly. This path guarantees a massive drop in the ranking points, furious sponsors, and hands the absolute clay court crown to Jannik Sinner without putting up a single fight. It is the smart choice, but it is a bitter pill to swallow for a fierce competitor. Path 2 is the terrifying alternative that could ruin everything forever. Ferrero completely caves to the immense public pressure. Carlos takes heavy injections of painkillers to artificially numb the agonizing pain in his right arm, and he steps onto the punishing red dirt of Paris, hoping for a total medical miracle. If he takes that second path, the risk is astronomical. One late swing on a heavy clay court return could snap the delicate tendon in his forearm completely and end his prime athletic years before they even truly begin. The entire legacy of Carlos Alcaraz rests squarely on the shoulders of Ferrero right now. He must be the villain to the media in order to be the savior to his player. The dark clouds hanging over this era of tennis are refusing to clear. Will Ferrero make the brutal choice to pull Carlos out entirely to save his career? Or will the crushing media pressure force them into a catastrophic mistake on the court? The final verdict regarding his participation at the French Open is going to drop at any moment and change the sport forever. So make sure you subscribe to the channel right now because we will bring you the exact truth the second this historic decision is finally made.